as you can hear, we are recording this. So if you don't want to be seen or heard, please mute your audio and switch off your video. So welcome to the launch of this year's Knowing Africa series, which is a seminar program that is designed to get people thinking about Africa as a space of knowledge making in its own terms, a space of creativity and excitement in which as you will see in the coming seminars, in which there's this incredible intellectual ferment, and who better to launch us off in this series than the foremost political philosopher of and in Africa, Achille Mbembe, my friend and colleague from Wits University. Achille is the distinguished professor of politics and history at WISER at the University of the Witwatersrand. He is well known to all of you, and I'm not going to go through his very extensive CV of many, many books, of many interventions of a broader nature in the public sphere. Achille, for the last quarter of a century, has given us the conceptual language to make sense of the world we live in, has decisively, I would say, demonstrated that the decolonial project, however you define it, is nothing new, has been in process for a long time, and whose work really have changed the terms of the relationship between scholarship about Africa and scholarship from Africa. So thank you very much, Achille. He is here today to speak about this rather controversial and thorny weapon that he has picked up. Achille was invited by President Emmanuel Macron to head up a commission in advance of a summit looking at the relationships between France and Africa. I think very brave of Mr. Macron to extend the invitation to one of the most fierce critics of Africa's actions and attitudes and worldview of itself in relation to Africa. So, offering it to Achille Mbembe was, I think, quite a brave choice, a bold choice. But equally bold, equally brave was that Achille Mbembe picked up the gauntlet and instead of staying in the comfortable place of critique, which is where most of us actually are happiest, he has stepped into the ring and is, I think, completely consistently, Achille, with the work you have always done, saying we have something to say and we are going to say it. And he has made the space to do it at a time when I guess anti-French sentiment in Africa, Achille, is probably higher than it's ever been before. So it takes a very large and very confident mind to step into this and steer us through it. And Achille will talk to us about the Commission's work and some of its recommendations. Today, we are very, very fortunate because the summit will be held in Montpellier next week on the 8th of October. And therefore we are at the cutting edge of this moment of interaction. He'll be followed then by Abubakar Sanogo responding to him, our colleague in film studies, closely at the heart of the work of the Institute of African Studies, an intellectual, and a curator of African film. Abubakar has been the major curator for such important film festivals as TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival. He's the founder of the African Film Festival in Ottawa, and has worked with institutions around the world. So this will be, I hope, an interesting engagement. I invite you to please mute yourselves, to put questions you may have in the chat as they come up, and to put your Zoom view to speaker view so that you are able to fully listen to our speakers today. Achille, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, first of all, I would really like to thank Shireen, not only for her introduction, but for who she is to many of us. I moved here in Johannesburg 20 years ago, and immediately Shireen welcomed me. And in fact, she has been encouraging me all along since then. And I have never told her about this, but I use this opportunity to say it. But I guess she might have guessed through some of our interactions how important she has been for me during my South African years. The paradox is that we miss her a lot here, and yet we constantly feel her presence in our midst, in our discussions, as well as in the debates going on in South Africa at large. So I'm very, very happy when she asked me to come to you. I didn't hesitate. In any case, I haven't learned to say no to her. I'm not going to start now. I would also like to acknowledge Femi and Abubakar. Abubakar, I knew, I've never met him in person, but I know about his tremendous work in African cinema. And I'm very grateful for what he has done to keep that part of our cultural production and creativity alive, both in the continent and elsewhere. Now, I agreed with Shireen that I would speak briefly, let's say for 15 to 20 minutes, because what is probably the most interesting is the conversation that I hope will ensue. I'm in two minds. As Shireen said, for the last 7 months, I have spent the bulk of my time preparing for the summit, the new Africa-France summit, which is taking place next week in Montpellier. In late January, I got a letter from President Macron asking me to accompany him, that were his terms, in this project. His hope was that the summit would be an important moment to give voice to the younger generation of Africans, as well as younger generations of French. To give voice for them to articulate how they foresee these old and acrimonious relationship between a former colonial power and African independent countries. His goal was to create the conditions for what he calls a refounding of these relationships. The French term is refondation. It's not exactly the same thing as a reset. Refondation has to do with going to the fundamentals and reshaping the fundamentals. So that is what he wanted to achieve. And he asked me to direct a cycle of public discussions and consultations in 12 African countries in order to elicit those voices. And the countries were South Africa, Angola, Kenya, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Cameroon, Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Ivory Coast, Senegal, and Tunisia. We couldn't do this everywhere. These were the 12 countries that were chosen. So I undertook to do this, and we had 66 public consultations, to which more or less 5,000 young people showed up, either virtually or in face-to-face meetings. And during those consultations, all imaginable themes were examined. First, were examined those key questions that are at the core of the conflict between France and Africa. First, the question of military intervention and the presence of military bases in a number of countries, including Gabon, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Djibouti, Chad. Second, the question of France's support granted to undemocratic regimes in the continent and so-called strongmen. The last example being what happened in Chad after the death of the president, I can't remember his name now, and the support France gave to the unconstitutional succession that ensued, the son of Idriss Déby taking over where his father had left. Third, the question of the CFA franc, questions relating to monetary sovereignty, of which we can speak about if you want. Fourth, the question of Francophonie, linguistic sovereignty, to which have to be added all other kinds of topics from so-called aide au développement, aid, debt, anything having to do with climate change, deforestation, gender issues, cultural creativity, restitution of African art objects. Everything was on the table. Nothing was left aside. Out of those discussions, a set of proposals had to be forged. I had set up a committee to accompany the process. It included a number of moral, intellectual figures, professionals, internationally renowned, such as Suleiman Bashir Diagne, who is a philosopher, such as Chimamanda Adichie, who is a well-known writer, Tuli Madonsela, who is a fantastic advocate from South Africa. There were 13 of them, impeachable people, to guarantee the independence of the process and the moral and ethical context that had to, let's say, preside over the process as such. A report, a final report, it's here, 170 pages, which will be delivered to President Macron on the 5th of October. I have also sent to him the 13 key proposals that have emerged out of the whole process, which he will study and adopt where necessary and implement them. So that's the part of the, let's say, the experience. When I agreed to go through this, there was immediately a whole set of responses, some of which were putting into question the reasons why I went into it. First of all, I didn't go into it for money. It's 0 cent. I wouldn't even take it if they offered it. I didn't go into it because I wanted to be co-opted. I don't need to be co-opted in the French system. I went into this because I think that there is a window of opportunity to finally put out there in the public domain, in a formal way, in a methodical manner, the terms of what opposes us to France. And to do it in the most formal of settings, which is a summit. The summit tradition in Franco-African relations was, in fact, created 27 years ago. All the summits that have taken place since the beginning brought together the French head of state and African heads of states. The novelty with this summit is that African heads of state are not invited. Civil society organizations are, from entrepreneurs to activists, to academics, to community leaders, leaders of various associations, intervening in a whole set of domains of everyday life in our communities. The summit will bring together 3,000 participants, 2/3 of whom are coming from Africa. I have worked over the last 7 months with 12 young people, young men, women, all genders, different profiles, so forth and so on. They will intervene during the only plenary session that will be taking place and carry forward in their own voices the key proposals their generation is putting on the table as a condition for the refounding of the relations. I agreed to go into it, this exercise, because over the last, let's say, 8-9 years, I have been working increasingly. My own personal intellectual and political trajectory has led me to reflect more than ever before on questions having to do with repair. The question of repair, the question of reparation eventually, that of restitution that has been taken up a few years ago by my friend Felwine Sarr, who produced a report once again for Emmanuel Macron on the thorny question of the restitution of African art objects which are detained in Western museums, especially in French museums. And he wrote a very important report on that. I have also been preoccupied as a result of the situation we found ourselves, the planet at large, with questions of what I call planetary habitability, of the conditions that are necessary for life as such to be maintained on Earth. And I did publish at the beginning of the year a piece some of you might be interested in reading. It is called, can't remember the title now. In any case, it has to do with the question of life, and it's called Futures of Life and Futures of Reason, where for the first time, these deep issues are addressed. For a very long time, a lot of my work has had to do with the question of the in common, as opposed to that of difference. It's not because I am against difference, but in line with that part of the Black critical tradition that has influenced me the most, Fanon, Glissant, and a number of others, the politics of commonality has attracted me much more than the politics of difference. And one can see it very clearly in Critique of Black Reason, which is the work in which these preoccupations are addressed as extensively as possible. But I have also been deeply influenced by my time in South Africa. Of course, Shirin can talk about this, and apparently she was talking about it again today. Of course, there have been numerous critiques of the South African trajectory that has led to the formal end of apartheid. The critique has been concentrated, indeed, on the limits of the truth and reconciliation trajectory, if you want to call it, or project, if you want to call it as such. And some of those critiques are, of course, justified. But it seems to me that there is something at the core of that project, something that has to do with, of course, the ethics of recognition, the ethics of dignity, shared dignity, but also the ethics of mutuality and reciprocity, all of which is premised on the idea that if I harm you, part of me is harmed in the process through which I harm you. And that has influenced me a lot, and has motivated me in the attempt at looking beyond the question of violence, which is so central to Fanon, for instance. And yet, even when we look at Fanon, there is a huge side of him that has to do with care. Not only because he was a doctor, but care, in fact, caring as a horizon in any attempt at reweaving or repairing the connections that have been broken. So I said yes to Macron because I believe that we have to repair that relationship, because I believe that that history is not going to end tomorrow. It's too late, because I believe that beyond state-to-state relations, there is something even deeper, which has to do with the connections that have been built. The works of les œuvres de l'esprit. I don't know how to translate it in English, but that term seems to me to capture what I mean. Those œuvres de l'esprit which have been created. And for sure, there must be something there which is precious enough to be salvaged. That's why I said, yes, I'll do it, but I'll remain clear-minded. So that's what I have tried to do. Now, let me just say 2 or 3 things quickly, and then we can open the discussion. We can go into the details. Of course, during the debates, the peculiar nature of the type of independence that was granted by France to African countries was debated. This independence without full sovereignty. It was clearly deeply interrogated. Independence without full sovereignty, which has led to a peculiar story of African leadership in Francophone Africa, which has led to the consolidation and condition in which government has been waging war against the means of existence of its own people for the last 60 years. A civil war, I don't find any other term to qualify it, that has been abetted by France in the name of security, stability, and development. So that has been interrogated. And this France has done through setting up peculiar infrastructures. And I use the term peculiar here, exactly in the way in which it was used in America under slavery, when slavery was, let's say, understood to be a peculiar institution. Peculiar infrastructures of coercion and of intimidation, military intimidation to begin with, in the sense of the establishment of military bases. We can go into the details. I have studied it over the last seven months, and it's not really funny. Infrastructures of coercion in terms of the franc CFA, spoke about it. Infrastructures of coercion, especially in terms of debt. The system of indebtedness, which is not typically Francophone or French, which in fact has to do with the whole of the global South. And in fact, the system that produces debt is what I'm talking about, which make it such that of course we can go through debt relief mechanisms today, but that's not enough. Is not enough to abolish existing debts. What needs to be abolished are the mechanism of an equal exchange which keep producing debt, indebtedness, and these new forms of enslavement. So all of that is on the table for Montpellier and more. But even more, the complex social movements and protests that have erupted have been going on over the last 10 years at least, and have made it such that things cannot keep going on the way they used to. France cannot pretend that they are not seeing, or that they are not hearing. There is now new forms of mobilization, more or less similar to what we saw during the anti-colonial era, which are led by young leaders, most of whom have emerged out of their local struggles in Burkina Faso, in Senegal, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Cameroon, so on and so on. But a great number of whom are also emerging from the diaspora, where people of African origin are facing the kinds of issues I'm sure those of you who are attending the conversation are familiar with. Conditions of minorities facing police violence, discrimination, and so on and so on. So there is a kind of convergence of struggles that is unfolding between the diaspora and those in the continent. Add to that the renewal of creativity in the cultural, artistic, field in terms of new modes of thinking. I have been myself involved in some of those experiments with the Atelier de la Pensée in Dakar, where a new form of self-confidence is emerging. We have something to say, not only about Africa, but about the world at large, because to some extent, Africa has a responsibility to vis-a-vis the world. And so if you want, that's the spirit in which I went into this, and that's the spirit in which I conducted it. And the report that I'm going to deliver to President Macron will contain most of what I have told you about and more, including the recommendations and the proposals. Let me add this, and I'll stop. I have worked with thousands of people during the last seven months. And this has given me a lot of hope in relation to our continent. I have also worked very closely with the French technostructure, from the Élysée to the Quai d'Orsay, to various diplomatic posts in the continent, to the Agence Française de Développement, financial authorities, and so forth, or military people for that matter. And France is at a crossroad. First of all, as every other state, it's not monolithic. You will find everything in it. If you are looking for support, you will find support. If you are looking for adversity, you will find adversity. So there is a possibility to build coalitions. And that seems to me absolutely important. The capacity, developing the capacity to craft the best coalitions possible around every theme or question we judge important. I have also, and I can say this, not met any unpleasant, I didn't have any unpleasant experience. Which means that there is a capacity also within the system to show respect and to listen. I'm not saying that this is the only thing, but there are possibilities of making a difference. But, and that's the last thing, if we want to make a difference, this requires an entirely new forms of intelligence. It requires entirely new modes of analysis, because there are certain forms of analysis that allow for identifying potentials or possibilities, and other forms of analysis that foreclose any such possibility. So a kind of intellectual reform is necessary if we want this type of projects to make a difference. So that's what I wanted to share broadly, and I'm at your disposal to continue the conversation and maybe go a bit more into details. Thanks, Shirin.
Thank you so much, Achille. This is absolutely marvelous beginning to the conversation, and very, very interesting propositions that you are leaving us with, including, I suppose, whenever all of us who read your work, we are struck by the way you are able to look despair in the face and nevertheless find some spaces for hope and moving forward. So thank you for that. Achille, we are watching the most magnificent summer storm play out through your windows behind you. And with little moments, it made your internet slightly unstable, but not enough to affect your meaning and delivery. Thank you. I'm going to turn to Abubakar now to maybe open up some questions and respond.
All right, well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you to Shireen for organizing this event, for inviting me to be part of it. I've really admired what you've done since you've come here to Carleton. With knowing Africa series has really been very important. I think it's really added significantly to the production of knowledge in Africa as it's centered at the Institute of African Studies. We like to say that this is the very first Institute of African Studies in Canada. And I have to really point out that your contribution has really helped in really consolidating this first nest starters, in particular from an epistemological standpoint. I would like to also thank Achille Mbembe for accepting our invitation, our Shireen's invitation, our Institute's invitation. First, to commend him for the great intellectual work that he's been involved in over the past few decades. From a personal standpoint, I've heard of him in 1996 when I went to Dakar for the first time, and I was told that there's somebody who's heading Codestria, who's really absolutely fantastic. And I've been wanting to find out a little more. I think it's under his regime at Codestria that I actually came to North America, to an African Humanities Institute. I was also interested to, I tried to read as much as I can of his intellectual production. And I've been wondering, in fact, what kinds of conversation could we have in Africa? Because my specialty is cinema, the moving image, in African cinema with him. It's clear that he's interested in cultural production. It's clear that a lot of what he says may have some resonance with what we're trying to do in African cinema. And I have to say that I was actually involved in having him invited. I don't know if the invitation ever went at FESPACO for the 50th anniversary, precisely because it was FESPACO is the most important film festival in Africa. So because of the 50th anniversary, I thought based on the kind of work he's doing, we could have an interesting conversation in terms of what this important institution for cinematic work of Africans could do with some of the groundbreaking work he was involved in. I've also been coming to his university over the past 4 or 5 years. I've participated with some colleagues of his at this university, great colleague, La Provost Khan, Cynthia, the history workshop, Noor and others who he probably knows, who have really supported the idea that we came up with in 2016 of trying to articulate the discourse on the archive, but grounded in Africa. And so what we've been trying to do in the past few years is to bring together academics, archivists, curators, filmmakers, and others to precisely have a conversation on the archive in Africa. And I'm aware of his intervention when Derrida came to his university and that big conference on the archive. And I thought maybe we could have a conversation as well on that front. So it's really out of an admiration for the work that I come here. And so I'd like, therefore, to react to some of the points he made. And I would say the surprise, so to speak, and shock, I would have to be honest, when I heard that he accepted this mission on the part of the French president, not alone, with many Africans, because I felt that his work in terms of really articulating a clear sense of an Africa that stands independent, sovereign, an Africa that's trying to really to emerge, so to speak, into its own subjectivity, to occupy, as he put it very well right now, the place it deserves in the world, is in fact, paradoxically, delayed and prevented to a large extent by the history of the French presence in Africa. We cannot deny it. People have used the term France-Afrique to describe the historical relation between France and Africa since the age of decolonization. By this concept, they mean the notion that an entire apparatus of policies, decisions, actions, institutions, personal, intersubjective networks, including what Achille mentioned, military intervention, the CFA franc, development aid, an equal relationship, economic relationship, the destabilization of African states, the control of the political economy of African cultural production, are part and parcel of a project that make possible and continue to make possible the status of France as a great power that matters in the world. It's not new. I think Achille himself has said it. To participate into its economic growth. And this concept and its various manifestation has been developed obviously over the, during the Cold War to prevent a kind of socialist turn for the continent. And of course, today to partly prevent the rise of China, Russia, and other emerging powers like India, Brazil, Turkey, and others, who are also trying to have a stake on this continent of ours. And so the France, if you will, that is underwriting the project that we just heard about, is therefore one, I think we must remember where, and I think he knows it, but so I'm just gonna say it because I prepared those notes, so I'm gonna get these words out. The legacies of continuing exploitation, destabilization of African countries. In my own country, obviously, I was born in Burkina Faso and lived, obviously, the shock and trauma of the Sankara regime, for example. And in fact, even in my own family, some of the consequences of this demise, in fact, have been felt, I have to say. So we knew that, with his advent and his positions in relation to France, his days would probably be numbered, and that his successor, who was in many ways instrumentalized by the French state and managed to hold on to power for up to 27 years, when the young people, some of whom probably Achille was able to meet in Burkina and across other places, decided that his time was up, they did not leave him in Africa, in Burkina Faso, sorry. So he was exfiltrated out of Burkina. We have these images online of his what do you call, his entourage in a beautiful limo, black limo that leaves the city of Ouagadougou and somehow exfiltrates him and drops him off in Abidjan. While obviously the young people precisely, who were trying to articulate some form of change, wanted some answers from him about these past 27 years. So the same system, therefore, is obviously part and parcel of legacies of exploitation of African resources. We know it very well. People have written that, in fact, the question of the Sahel may even be traced back all the way back to the decolonization era, where the finding of the multiple mineral resources and uranium and all that stuff, and plans about them were being developed, but let's say tempered by the decolonization process, and are being, to a large extent, reactivated today. For example, in the case of Mali, some of the Malian colleagues have expressed to me, and they've said it publicly as well, that, for example, as we speak, so as the summit is being organized, some defense agreements were signed between the two countries, for example, and that one cannot even, let's say, a plane cannot even take off from the territory of Mali without first obtaining permission from the French state, for example. And this is as we speak today, on 29th of September, 2021. Legacies of cultural dependence. Obviously, in the field of cinema, we know it way too well, because cinema is one of the fields where you don't just need, I would say, not that you just need this or that, but that, you know, because of its technological infrastructure, it requires more funding, if you will, than many other art forms. And that in the ways in which it developed in the relationship between Africa and France, and some of our most fantastic filmmakers, Hondo, Ousmane Sembène, and others, have always, of course, complained about this question of that historical legacy, unfortunately. In fact, few people know, for example, that African cinema, when it was distributed abroad, it was often distributed by an organization called an Association for the Diffusion of French Thought, for example, which is a bit of a paradox for an entire continental institution. And so, also, I guess perhaps one of the remarks is, of course, the question of this summit, not the summit in particular, but let's say, as I think you mentioned, the practice of the summit, the institution of the summit, which, as you said, has been a historical institution in the relationship between France and Africa, but has been primarily a head of state institution. But there's been other summits that are not only about the head of, sometimes it's by cultural workers, you know, and so on, where people have been gathered. And in some ways, it's a very interesting mechanism, because it's one of the ways in which one could argue, really, and people have argued, people have argued, that it's one of the systems whereby, as the French state still manages to govern, if I want to use Foucault's term, governmentality, to govern the mind, so to speak, the intellectual minds of African creative personnel, etc. So it's often, basically, often they bring people are brought to these summits, and ideas are produced, multiple ideas, fantastic ideas are produced, but that go into, let's say, feeding development of French policies toward Africa. But that could, of course, have been deployed maybe also on the African continent to develop African policies toward African culture in various ways in which one may work toward the emancipation of Africa. And so in some ways, let's say the paradox of our moment is, on the one hand, a head of state who is really, as you said, very charming. I think you mentioned that in one of the interviews. Very intellectually agile. He can quote Fanon, he can quote Césaire, no less, which is absolutely fantastic. But when you see the actions that he presides over, they are against everything that Fanon stands for. They're against everything that Sankara stands for, you know? And so it's a problem. It's a problem. It's a problem. And so I guess I'm going to ask you a number of questions. So I guess I'm not alone, but many people, let's say, are asking themselves, really are scratching their head about the acceptance of this work, this mission, simply. In terms of charm, we can say, well, you can say that, yes, maybe the French president has some charm, but so did Lumumba, tremendous. So did Nkrumah, tremendous. So did Sankara. I think nobody would doubt that. And so to what extent may let's say, the memory of the charms of both their personality and their project have informed maybe some of the decision or some of the thinking around that. You mentioned toward the end, you tried to, I think you inscribed your decision to accept, let's say, the commission around, as part of the itinerary of your evolution as an intellectual. And I can see that. I can see that very. I think that if one reads your work and indeed some of the interview, one can see that it might to some extent be almost a natural development of some of the directions your work is going. And so it reminded me of a statement by Homi Bhabha, of a title by Homi Bhabha, which he presented a paper at a conference on cinema in Edinburgh in 1986, if my memory is correct. And the title of the presentation was The Commitment to Theory. And I remember I had a PhD student, because in fact he came to my university and they invited him like they are being invited today. And they chose 5 of us, 5 PhD students, to write something that resonated with his work, that he would read, we would send him, he would read, and when he would come to campus, we would have a conversation around that work. And I tried to react on precisely this idea of the commitment to theory, and I said, maybe we should ask our intellectuals to be less committed to theory and more to their people, so to speak. That's really my boutade, so to speak, at that time. But I'm wondering if there's also something along those lines. In other words, the logical development of your thought process seems indeed to take you precisely toward a space beyond, I say beyond Africa. So you're talking about the global, also a space beyond, let's say, difference, but one that seeks commonalities. And so the question really is, one could argue that this is what all the critiques of France-Afrique have been looking for. People have been looking for commonalities since, in fact, before independence. If we know the history of colonialism very well, when colonialists came to Africa, they were not really immediately forced. People welcomed them, fed them, just like here in North America, right? Gave them space. So there's a whole politics of hospitality, in fact, that presided the welcoming of colonialism in Africa. But the colonialists came with a plan, which is to displace the sovereignty of Africans, to rearrange the relationship that Africans had among themselves, and in relation to their interests. And I'm not talking about France alone here, all the countries involved in the colonial project, obviously, etc. And so we can argue that it is really the colonizer who refused the idea and the possibility of the politics of the common, not the colonized or the formerly colonized. And so I'm wondering, therefore, in thinking of this mind frame, what exactly you think about that, so to speak. You also mentioned, so I'm going to just throw out all my questions and then leave the floor to other people to speak, I guess. But
and keep it quick, and keep it short if you don't mind.
Yeah, just 1 minute or 2 minutes maximum. maybe in relation to actually what you mentioned very quick. So again, you also mentioned, for example, that in your experience, you felt a certain sense of the possibility to create some alliances within the French state, for example. Let's say France in general, not the French state, France. So in other words, there are oppositional voices in France with whom alliances could be struck. So one could argue that this has historically been the case, right? I mean, in cinema, for example, we know that at the darkest hour of French colonialism, there were people like René Vauthier who did films like Afrique 50 that really spoke, in order to turn their camera against the colonial system that had sent them to Africa and took sides, so to speak, with Africans, both in Ivory Coast and Burkina and in Algeria afterward. And so there's always been, there's a history, even the history of anti-colonialism, there's always, obviously, within the colonized space, also forces, anti-colonial forces, because we imagine a polity where there are debates about what kind of ideology for a particular country. Colonialism is one, but there are others as well. And so that was always the case, in my opinion, even back in the early 1900s, and of course throughout the decolonization movement, and so on. So I'm curious to know what you feel is new, really, at this particular historical moment with that. I guess finally, then I'll let it go. Why do you think this report is necessary? In some ways, everything that needed to be said about the relation between France and Africa, you yourself have said, in my opinion, you've said certainly a lot about that relationship. In very critical terms, very poignant. I mean, you really managed to put the words on this question. And so, since you're an academic, why not just give a bibliography? Why get involved? You know what I mean? Why get involved in a report? You could have said, okay, well, read Fanon, Cézanne, myself, Bashir Jai, everybody else, read all of these guys, watch, I don't know, all of African cinema, watch French news, the montage of Inatek, watch, I mean, watch African news. I mean, these debates are really, to a large extent, in the public domain, it seems to me. And so one wonders, why is a report necessary? Why is such a mission necessary? And what difference really will it make if indeed all this is already there? And finally,
you get one finally.
Yes, yes. Let's imagine that, the current president, who seems to have some idea or desire to change, at least your perception of it, is not reelected for some reason, and the reports never get implemented, which I'm sure have fantastic ideas. Then what? Then what? What were the result and the price of all these efforts, of all these trips, of all these countries to really mobilize themselves to put these ideas? And why perhaps were these not done for an African state? Let's say for the African Union, for example. Of course, African states are imperfect. We know that our presidents are very imperfect. Nobody will deny that. But I don't think their project is, at least globally speaking, continental, their project is exactly the same. And to what extent might this work have also been done within, if you will, the context of an African polity? Yeah, so I'll just leave it. I have more, but I'll just leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Abubakar. Do you want to have a go at answering some of those questions anyway, Achille?
Maybe just some comments, because there are lots of them. And but I would like to thank Bakar for the care with which he went through what he has just shared with us. There are some questions that are easy to answer. I didn't do this for the African Union or any African president. They didn't ask me to do it. Would I have done it? It would be different. The target is different. The historical moment, what is peculiar to this moment is that, in fact, we are no longer in the France-Afrique regime. And that is a mistake many analysts are making, to believe that the system has not changed at all. It keeps reproducing itself almost in the same form as it has always been. That one of the limits of the critique, the dominant critique of French-African relations is the belief, indeed, that it doesn't change. In fact, and I have spent quite a lot of time, going back into history and learning about it, reading reports, interviewing people. In fact, if there's one thing that is really perverse about so-called France-Afrique, it's its extraordinary capacity for mutation. And unless we delineate as carefully as possible those mutations and their effects, we will be shooting in the wrong way. We won't identify what the target is all about. And in fact, we'll start shooting at each other rather than shooting at the enemy on guillemets. So this question of analysis is not just an academic question. It's more than an academic question. I mentioned the infrastructures of, I said, coercion, not cohesion, as somebody put it in the chat. Coercion, putting dispositives of force, of brutality, if you want. But there are even more insidious dispositives in the French form of imperial domination, which has to do with knowledge, the apparatuses of knowledge, the cognitive ecology, if you want. Beginning with language, with the vocabulary, the semantics, the refusal to name things, the propensity to elide naming, which is astounding. So all of those things, I think, are absolutely important. Now, the moment is peculiar because there's more room for maneuver, which is different from a perspective which says, okay, it is all powerful, there's not much to be done, you can't go in, you have to destroy it from the outside. And yet we have been talking about destroying it from the outside for 60 years, not much has happened. We have to observe that somewhere the methods, the forms of organization we have used over 60 years, they have serious limits. Because if they didn't, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about what we're talking about now. So we have to somewhat reorganize ourselves in all those. So there's more room for maneuver for the following reasons. First of all, French hegemony in Africa is declining. It is declining not so much because we really put pressure on it. If anything, it has resisted pressure, been able to transform itself. It is weakening because France no longer has the means to implement its overall objectives. For instance, France is no longer able alone to stabilize any African country. Look at Mali, I mean, the Central African Republic. They no longer have the means to be all hegemonic. In Mali, they are forced to resort to what they did during the First World War, the Second World War, meaning bring around them African tirailleurs, Chad, the G5, Chad, Niger. They need them. They need the Americans who are reluctant to commit. They need Europe, and Europe is very suspicious of French adventures in the continent. So we are witnessing, in fact, what we are seeing is that Africa is the place where, paradoxically, French limits to its power are now, in fact, so if we do that, if we take that perspective as the starting point, it leads us to a whole set of different actions we wouldn't take if we assume that they are all powerful, it doesn't change, so forth and so on. And you yourself said it, you have the emergence of new actors. The point is, how is it that we consolidate African power in order to better negotiate and negotiate a better deal among these many different actors? And that's where part of the issue, the question really rises, because I have to tell you, I mean, I'm not betraying here any state secret. On the franc CFA, for instance, you would be on the franc CFA on restitutions, on military bases, on a whole set of issues we consider absolutely crucial. Those who are supposed to lead us are missing. As simply as that. In fact, on the CFA front, what's his name? He mobilizes people. They go on the street, they want to delink from the CFA franc. There's a popular demand for that. African leaders go and see Emmanuel Macron and tell him, you can't do that. The same thing with agreements on migration. When they go to La Valette and sign those agreements with European Union on migratory conditionalities, we give you this amount of money, you act as our policeman in the continent, to the point where Abubakar, he wants to go from Ouagadougou to Dakar, and the assumption is that, in fact, Senegal is just a transit country, that his real aspiration is to go to Europe. He's not going to Dakar. He wants to go to Europe. So stop him before he moves from Ouagadougou. They subscribe to that. On restitutions, a law has been adopted by the French Parliament is not a good law. It has to change. What we need is a general law on restitution. We don't need a case-by-case law on each and every single object. So when I write a report and I say this is what we need, it becomes a matter of public discussion. It becomes a matter that then leaves the pure academic realm and enters into the political realm, political in the broad sense, and policy realm. And how do you translate that into actual practice? So look, I could speak on all of this. Commitment to theory as opposed to commitment to people. I would say commitment to truth to begin with. Don't forget theory, don't forget the people, but you start with commitment to truth. And as a theorist or whatever, you are a witness to that. You are accountable to that. That's how I understand it. Now, the point really is, I'm not saying that fighting from the barricade is not necessary. Of course, it is necessary. Of course, we have to support it. But it alone is not enough. We have to learn how to fight at the interstices of the system. And that requires an entirely different form of reason or of intelligence, if you want. And we don't have enough of that. At a time when things are becoming ever more complex, we need both. So the report will be absolutely important because it brings in the realm of the political, of policy making, issues we have been barking from the barricades and nobody was listening. Now they have no choice. They have to listen. And even more so, they have to be seen to be doing something about it, which opens up a tiny space for us, which we have to occupy and expand. And it requires a different pedagogy, I think. As for Macron, I mean, look, this was, the journalist asked me how he was. And I told the journalist, I mean, what my experience was. But that didn't really impact on what I write or what I think. I mean, he's a pleasant guy. He should, what should I say? I mean, he was not unpleasant, not at all. But that doesn't matter when it comes to doing the work I was asked to do. And Shireen said he was bold. He was. And in fact, he's not expecting me to be other than who I was before I took the job. I agreed to participate in the mission. And that's to his credit.
Thank you. You know, I guess that the skepticism, the fatalism, even, you know, that is pervasive. You see, Achille, in some of the questions, and I think you have made a very serious riposte to that sense of, well, you know, nothing will change. But as you have always said, we have to make the propositions. And, you know, if indeed Macron does not do anything with it, I don't, you know, I think what I'm interested in is seeing that report and seeing the kind of energy and ideas and hoping that the fact that it comes from somewhere, even if it doesn't go immediately in the short term anywhere, that in itself is a vital part of the process of occupying public space and and making the propositions. One cannot account for what politicians may eventually do or not do with these things, right? You know, we are all, everybody, nobody, I think, in the questions is naive about the possible effect that this will not go anywhere. But that seems to not be the reason to do nothing in any case. I think, you know, people are leaving because our time slots work so that there is a class in 6 minutes, I think, and so people are leaving. I'm not going to open this up to any more discussion because I think you have, in fact, responded to many of the key points that are raised in the conversation. Some of them, you know, we could go on debating, obviously, for quite a while. I want to thank you, Achille. I think that we are, obviously the report is not yet publicly available. Am I right? It will be next week.
It will be given to him next week on the 5th of October. But the proposals have already, he has received them. And he will act on some of them.
Yes. And he has, or did you say he has acted?
He has got the 13 proposals. Mm-hmm. He will act immediately on some of them.
Okay.
Not all of them now, but on the key proposals, he will act on it.
But for us as the public interested in reading that report,
yes,
we will wait.
Then, yes. Of course, I mean, the format in those things is that you give it to him, and then when he has read it, it can go public. So it will go public on the evening of the 5th, before the summit.
Well, I wish you a very energetic summit, and I hope that there is, you know, that we now will be watching with great interest to see where it goes from here. And thank you once again, Achille. Thank you everybody for coming. It's been marvelous. I thank you. Please, you know, look at the Institute website for upcoming events. I encourage you also to look at events that take place at WISER, at Wits University under Sarah Nuttall's directorship. A really lively and interesting set of discussions there. And I look forward to seeing everybody on Zoom again soon. Thank you.
Thanks.